Hi, Facebook friends. Helen Archontou here, CEO of the YWCA of Northern New Jersey. So grateful to have this time with you this morning. As you know, YWTV is all about educating, inspiring, and supporting our community. And today we have a very special episode, and I'm so grateful to have my sister leaders from the YWCAs in New Jersey to join me for this event. I have Tay Walker with me, who is the Executive Director of the YWCA Princeton, and Lilien, who is the CEO of the YWCA of Union County. And I can confidently speak on behalf of the three of us that we're so grateful and honored to have US Senator Cory Booker join us this morning to talk with him about some key issues that impact women, girls, and families in our state of New Jersey. So for those of you who are new to the YWCA, I want to make sure that you know that our YWCA USA and our New Jersey affiliates have been on the forefront of the most critical social movements for about 160 years, from women's empowerment to civil rights to affordable housing, pay equity, violence prevention, healthcare. These are the areas that we focus. Our current priorities nationally are around women's and girls' needs that are centered around racial justice and civil rights, economic empowerment and economic advancement, and health and safety. We will be asking the senators some questions, and if there's time allowed at the end, we will take some questions from our viewers. So with that, today our YWCA New Jersey associations in partnership will be talking to the senator about systemic racism and how it impacts women. Our goal for our viewers is to learn about the intersectionality between women and racism, especially the areas around healthcare, economic empowerment, and childcare. And we want to make sure that everyone understands what's happening on the federal level to help address these areas and how we can help as citizens here in New Jersey. So Senator Booker believes that the American dream isn't real for anyone unless it's within reach for everyone. He has dedicated his life to fighting for those who have been left out, left behind, or left without a voice. He grew up here in Northern New Jersey and received his undergraduate and master's degree from Stanford University. At Stanford, the senator played varsity football, volunteered for the campus peer counseling center, and wrote for the student newspaper. He was awarded the Rhodes Scholarship and went to study at the University of Oxford and then Yale Law School, where he graduated in 1997. He moved to Newark after law school and started a nonprofit organization to provide legal services for low-income families, helping tenants take on slumlords. And in 1998, he moved into the Brick Towers in Newark, and which eventually became a housing project. And he lived there until the project was demolished in 2006. He served as mayor from 2006 to 2013, and during his tenure, the city experienced economic growth on a scale that it had not seen since the 1960s. In addition to his leadership, overall crime declined, affordable housing and green spaces massively expanded, city services were made efficient, educational opportunities increased. It was a good time for Newark. And in 2013, he won a special election to represent New Jersey in the United States Senate. And in November of 2014, he was reelected to a full term. As New Jersey's junior Senator Booker has brought an innovative and consensus building approach to tackling some of the most difficult problems facing New Jersey and our country. And he presently sits on the Judiciary Committee, the Foreign Relations Committee, the Environment and Public Works Committee, and the Small Business Committee. So after all that, welcome, Senator Booker. So happy to have you with us.
Helen, it's so good to be on with you. And I just can't thank you enough for that generous introduction, but even more so to invite me into community right now, into conversation. And you all in so many ways affirm this understanding that it is about intersectionality, it is about connection, it is about what Martin Luther King said, that we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a common garment of destiny, and that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. But there's an affirming spirit here, which is understanding the power of women in every generation of America, the force, despite wretched injustices and oppression, women have managed to be the strength and the hope and the promise of America in every single generation. I wrote a book a number of years back, and as my mom read it, reminded me that unintentionally or not, that it really was a testimony to the power of women and how they've shaped my life. From Lee Porter, who is at 93 years old in Bergen County, still leading the Fair Housing Council and helped my family when we were turned away from house after house after house. My parents lied to because of the color of their skin that houses were sold. She, with working with lawyers, engineered a sting operation that helped my family integrate a suburban community in northern New Jersey, where I was blessed to grow up in, all the way from Lee Porter to a woman named Miss Virginia Jones, who was the tenant president in those high-rise projects in which I lived, who taught me that hope is not some kind of Pollyannish view. Hope is work, hope is sweat, hope is bloodied and battered, and ultimately hope is the active conviction that despair will never have the last word. And so I just feel incredibly blessed to be here with you today, because this is another time in which is going to demand the work, the sacrifice, and the struggle of our hope. And I see within the women who lead your organizations, the women who are on this call right now, I see it as our best hope, really, for us enduring and surviving, and witnessing you all, your grit and your grace, your love and your light working. It is inspiring to me, and I'm looking forward to continuing in partnership with you. And I'm blessed by this conversation. I'll leave you with a little bit more of Miss Jones's wisdom when I first moved here to Newark, and then we can start the conversation. But I still remember, I live in a tough neighborhood. In the 90s, it was very challenging. The 2010 census, the median income here was $14,000 per household, and yet we never mistaken my community wealth with worth. And I still remember when Miss Jones and I first met, she challenged me to describe the neighborhood to her, standing on the street that's right up the block from where I am right now. And I described what I saw from an abandoned building that used to be on the corner where drugs were dealt out of, graffiti, and I just described it. And the more I talked, the more angry she looked. And I'm finally like, I stopped, and she just looks at me and she goes, "You can't help me." And I go, "What do you mean?" She goes, "You need to understand that the world you see outside of you is a reflection of what's inside of you. And if you're one of these people who only sees problems and darkness and despair, that's all there's ever going to be. But if you're one of those stubborn people who every time you open your eyes, you see hope, you see possibility, you see love, you see the face of God, then you can be one of those people that helps me." And so I want to thank you all for being that kind of visionary, and have the willingness to roll up your sleeves and do the work of love. And I'm just grateful to be here with you in a time of a pandemic, economic downturn, racial reckoning. We clearly have so much work to do, but you all source my spirit, and I'm just grateful.
Well, what a beautiful story to share, and a great place for us to start. And I know that I speak for all of us and our national CEO that we all do this from a place of love, for sure. So I'm going to kick off by introducing Lilien, our CEO of YWCA Union County, and she'll ask our first question.
Thanks, Helen, and thank you, Senator Booker, and your words, as always, continue to inspire me. So healthcare disparities are enormous and growing, particularly in the area of maternal and neonatal health among Black women and women of color. The COVID crisis has only put these disparities in even higher focus, with Black people and people of color experiencing higher morbidity and mortality rates and inadequate levels of medical care. What can we do to ensure that Black people and people of color do not continue to experience these vast disparities? And how can universal healthcare help to play a role in addressing health disparities?
Thank you for that question, Janet. And it is an anguished question, that how can we, the richest nation on the planet Earth, have the worst outcomes in the developed nation for everything from maternal mortality to just lack of access to critical care for women. At a time we also see assaults on women's reproductive rights, access to healthcare in many states, and contraceptive care being torn down or blocked. We are at a time of crisis, and most Americans don't recognize the depth of the crisis. And what's even more sort of punishing to the spirit, as you aptly point out, is the racial disparities. If we already lead the nation's developed countries in maternal mortality, for example. It is so tragic that for African-American women, they die in childbirth about 4 or 5 times, about 4 times the rate that white women do. And this is outrageous, and there's no justification for that. It costs us so much more money, for example, to do prenatal care in emergency room hospitals. It costs us more money from the complications from people not having access to healthcare. And when it comes to human flourishing, to not have the access to the basics, whether it is healthy foods, with so many African-American women living disproportionately in food deserts, to a healthy environment with so many African-American women, expecting mothers living in toxic areas with polluted water and polluted air. We see so much of a disproportionate reality that causes us to have a nation that has health outcomes that are unacceptable, period, but disparities in health outcome that are, to me, violence made manifest. And so my work in the Senate as your senator has been from the very beginning to go at this. When I first got into the Senate, one of my first bills I introduced was this idea that the Senate should have a comprehensive commission to study health disparities. It was called the Reduce Act, because you've got to have the data to really understand a problem if you're going to actually fix it. And from that point on, I've been working to challenge our federal government to begin to be more responsive and proactive. With this COVID crisis, I partnered with my colleagues to create a really in-depth report on prescriptive policy solutions to address the staggering racial disparities during this pandemic and health crisis, with Senator Kamala Harris, who's been my partner on so many things when it comes to racial justice. We introduced the COVID-19 Racial and Ethnic Disparities Task Force Act, which would create a task force to research the racial disparities and, again, to know the depths and the contours of the problems. Senator Warren and I have introduced legislation to really require in the Trump administrations, their HHS, their Health and Human Services committee agency, to collect and report racial data and other demographic data. And so for me, so much of this is about pushing these issues not only into the consciousness of an administration and their priorities, but also to our national consciousness as well, to really hope to motivate more of us who are activists to begin to push our government to do something about it. I am proud of the people on this call and others in New Jersey working with Governor Murphy and really want to thank him for his leadership on mandating this data at the state level that helps us so much. I'm going to continue that work and that championing. But I want to just say something that might end up being a theme of this is we cannot let ourselves grow comfortable with anything of the status quo. We can't be part of a course of people that are calling for a return to normalcy. I don't want normalcy. What was normal before this crisis was unacceptable. And what I hope that through our activism we can do at the local, state, and federal level is continue to push policies and legislation that will actually help us to heal this gap and close the breach so that we can be a nation within our healthcare system that reflects our highest ideals, this ideal of equality for all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. So a question for you. We know that criminal justice reform at all levels is essential to reduce the disparate impact on Black people and people of color who suffer a disproportionate amount of bias in these systems, such as law enforcement, incarceration, and others. Along with eliminating racism, the YWCAs across our country focus on empowering women, and in particular, Black women and women of color. And we know that they experience bias as evidenced with lack of understanding around issues around domestic and sexual violence and law enforcement and other systems. How can we also ensure that the voices of women are included when we are addressing systemic racism and trying to make systemic change so that women, and in particularly Black women and women of color, can be included as part of the current focus for change in these systems?
Well, I think that this is a real crisis that we still have, that's persistent, about having women of color Forgive me, I just watched Hamilton on Disney Plus. So in the room when it happens, as they say,
Yes.
don't trigger me. I'll start singing. Um, let me just tell you a short story. I get to the United States Senate and I was stunned. I'm only the fourth popularly elected African American to the Senate in our history, and when I got there, I was the only African American in the Democratic caucus, for example. And I was just stunned at the lack of diversity in the one of the most important legislative bodies, not only in our nation, but that we make decisions that affect the planet Earth. And there were there were few people of color on committee staffs or that I could see on critical areas. And it just was stunning to me. And I working with a great senator from Hawaii named Brian Schatz, we challenged Chuck Schumer, who was eager to work with us to try to address that. And one of the things we just basically did is ask for public accountability for the data on diversity in the United States Senate. And he actually made a rule, wasn't altogether popular, that every senator now has to publish, it's been 4 years since, publish the diversity statistic, diversity and race diversity on their staffs. And having the light of day in the Senate, on the Democratic side, we have seen a massive shift to more women of color being hired in the United States Senate. And I'm proud to say, in fact, my legislative leader, who's a Latina woman, we've just noted that there are so many more women now on committees in position of color, in position of authority on staffs, and it really makes a difference. And you could be a well-intentioned person, but if we don't have people with diverse lived experiences at the table, the policy won't affect that. And I'm going to self-implicate here. I ran for Senate when I began this office 6 years ago, talking up and down our state, not only about the issues that I was going to fight for in New Jersey, from infrastructure investment for our public schools, but I told people that another agenda of mine was reforming the criminal justice system that is so wretched in this country and so violating of our values, of our common principles and ideals. And I get to the Senate and I'm still talking about it, but women in a lot of the lectures I would give or forums I would be in would call me out and just say, even reflexively, I was only saying men. I was using the gendered term often. And I realized, to my own shame, that I had never, ever, I've been visiting prisons, federal and state prisons since I was a law student, but I had never visited a female penal institution and rectified that. And the first one I went in, I'll never forget the warden. I asked her this question: how many women here are survivors of sexual trauma? And this tough woman stops, looks at me, and I saw her pain. And she said, about 90% of my women are survivors of rape and sexual trauma. And she and I, the warden and I, had this painful conversation about how this is the fastest growing prison population in America. Women, now we are a nation that has 1 out of every 3 incarcerated women on the planet Earth, that we have routinely torture women in our prisons by shackling pregnant women up. When I went in and finally met with the population, they had scheduled a big tour for me, but I actually just ended up sitting down with the women and the general population and just talking. My whole time I used just to talk and listen to them. And I heard awful stories about women who had to make terrible decisions between paying usurious costs to call their children, who were often separated, in more than one household or foster home, and they have to make a decision whether they're going to pay those costs of phone calls or buy tampons. And they told me these stories about having to make their own tampons. And just the more I talked, the more I was outraged. And it led to me leaving, start working on a bill, and then call one of my partners, Elizabeth Warren, together. And we wrote a big bill called the Dignity Act, which before we could even get it passed in the United States Senate, about 12 different states picked up our legislation and introduced it because there was no defending it. I found myself going on national TV, constantly challenging the fact that we do not have menstrual equity in our prisons, and the conditions of women that were just so horrific that I couldn't believe it was 20 2015, and these Byzantine practices were still going on. And so I tell you my own growth as a man who represents you, that I have found it indispensable to have women at the table when my office is making policy. As I said, my chief of policy now is a woman of color, and to make sure that the voices of women are brought to the table in every step that we have, and that we also work to elect more women. I am so proud that New Jersey has changed the shame that when I was first elected, we didn't have one woman in our federal delegation. And now, from Bonnie Watson Coleman, our first woman of color in our congressional delegation ever, to incredible women like Monkey Cheryl, New Jersey is starting to correct ourselves. And so this is real. It's not a matter of, it's nice to have diversity around the table. No, it's essential for crafting policy and correcting the vast disparities that exist, that we still in this country have such shameful corners of oppression that even the most conscious men and the well-intentioned men won't address unless women are actually leading and a part of the process of policymaking.
Thank you for that, Senator. I'd like to introduce Tay Walker, who is my counterpart and the Executive Director of YWCA Princeton.
Hi, good morning, Senator, and I just want to thank you again. You have always personally and professionally inspired me, so I thank you for your strong voice and always using it for us. So, Senator Booker, I would like to ask, my question is, quality, affordable, accessible early child care and education is critical in reducing barriers to successful workplace participation by women, especially Black women and women of color. Economic empowerment is not achievable without workplace participation. YWs know how important high quality, affordable care is to all families. With parents furloughed, laid off, or unable to work, the overall demand for child care services has dropped drastically and programs are shuttered. Yet at the same time, child care is the key service for all workers with young children. What programs are available or planned to help families access and pay for early childhood education?
So, there's that old saying, makes me want to holler. I mean, this is something that makes me want to holler. I get very angry and very emotional because I see this in my own community. In my own book, I wrote about an incredible woman, God rest her soul, she's now passed, Natasha Laurel, who worked in an IHOP on Bergen Street here in Newark, and just told her story about living in a nation, the only one that doesn't have things like paid family leave. Here's a woman that worked a full-time job, caught extra shifts where she can, still did not make enough money, so she needed food stamps, a SNAP to help her make ends meet, housing subsidies to help her because of, again, the lack of workplace economic justice in our country. She told me this painful moment in her life where right across the street from the IHOP on Bergen Street is the hospital emergency room, and her child with asthma, again, children in New Jersey who live in urban areas often have 3 or 4 times the asthma rates that you see in the suburbs, like the area I grew up in. And Black children with asthma are 10 times more likely to die of asthma complications than white children. And so here her child is across the street in a hospital emergency room, and she has to stop with the thought that if she leaves her job, she gives up a paycheck that she desperately needs to provide for her family, and had that awful sort of conflict that millions of American women have every day about being there for a sick child or not. And so this issue of childcare is outrageous because all the data shows that affordable quality childcare, investments in affordable quality childcare return massive dividends for this country as a whole in terms of the productivity of that child, the success of that child in life, lower trips to the emergency room, greater health, lower involvement with police. I could go through study after study that show that this is what we need, but yet we have this nation where in most states, affordable quality childcare is more expensive than tuition at your local state college. and we are way out of whack again with our industrial peers who have affordable, if not free, quality childcare, because they don't view a child's well-being starting in kindergarten. They know that 95% of brain development happens from the second trimester to the fourth or fifth year. But yet in America, we do not have universal prenatal care. In America, we do not have universal child care. In America, we do not have universal paid family leave. And in all of those things, we are an outlier. The Congo and Afghanistan have paid family leave. And so as your senator, we came out swinging on this issue. I'm proud to be a original co-sponsor of the Universal Child Care and Early Learning Act. I introduced myself, the Prospect Act, to provide child care services at no cost to parents enrolled in community college. This is an issue I've been fighting on in this COVID crisis, trying to make sure that we work our way towards affordable childcare, universal preschool, paid family leave. Again, as the wealthiest nation on the earth, we should be setting the standard for how much we love our children. And love is not sentimentality, it's not words. Love should be reflected in law and justice. And so I'm right now, this is the fight. The first CARES Act, which we stood in the well of the Senate as Democrats and refused to let go forward until it was more expansive. It provided about $3.5 billion in additional funding for childcare development block grants to our states. It got over $62 million in it for supplemental funding specifically for New Jersey. I'm really proud that Senator Menendez and I were able to secure that $62.5 million and an additional $3 billion in funding for the governors of our state nation to use for early childhood education. And so I'm going to prioritize that in this next battle for COVID that's going to start a week from next week, I should say Monday. We go back into the Senate to battle for this. But this has got to be a movement in America. It has got to be a movement to tell everyone, whatever your political bias, if you consider yourself, I'm a fiscal conservative, this is the right thing to do. If you consider yourself a person that believes the most valuable natural resource for a nation is not oil, gas, or coal, but the genius of our children, which we do not cultivate as well as our competitor nations. Whatever your background, whatever your bias on the political spectrum, this is a fulcrum point to turn the destiny of this nation if we begin to prioritize childcare, universal preschool, universal prenatal care, programs like nurse family partnerships. I can go on about the investments that if we make them, doula care for low-income women, if we make these kind of investments, I promise you the data shows and the moral urgency should make us know that this will have a dramatic difference, not only the well-being of low-income women, of minority women and children, but the whole nation will thrive and flourish if we actually make this a movement in America and go from an anguished present, a distraught past, to a future of justice for our nation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And on behalf of all of the YWCAs in New Jersey, myself and Jan and Tay, we really appreciate your time and attention to these matters that are so important to us. We're so grateful that we have you voting on these issues and writing legislation and pushing these matters forward. You've always been there for us and gathered us around a table and been there to listen so that you could take our views back to Washington, D.C., and we're grateful for that. We appreciate this time today, and we urge all of our followers to make sure that you register to vote and to make sure that the priorities of women, girls, and families are at the forefront of your decisions when you are hitting in the ballot box who you're voting for. Senator, thank you so much.
Hey, Helen, I know we're over time, but can I just say some final words, if I may?
You sure can.
Oh, thank you. I first of all, to Tay and Jan, thank you for your kind words and insightful questionings. You guys are light warriors, and I'm thankful for that. But you got me all inspired. So I started with Ms. Jones. I want to end with her because she's really one of my greatest role models. This woman whose son was literally murdered in the lobby of the building I would move into, and she just has saw through her own personal experience sort of the wretchedness of this world. And I always say that if America hasn't broken your heart, you don't love her enough, because there are such heartbreaking things that go on in our country. And her son was murdered in the 80s, and in one of my toughest moments in my life, when I was in 2004 walking in my neighborhood here, and as we know, this gun violence in our country is so outrageous. We've seen such violence happening as weapons flow into our communities that should be stopped with common sense gun safety laws. And so in 2004, I was there as to try to stop a teenager who had been shot. And it was gruesome and traumatizing, trying to stop the blood flowing from his body everywhere. And the glorification we do of violence doesn't capture how horrific it is to watch someone die. And I just remember frantically throwing my hands in his mouth, trying to clear passageways. Foamy blood seemed to pour out, as it seems his lungs were punctured by the bullets. And by the time the paramedics came and shoved me out of the way and ripped open his shirt, I saw more clearly the bullet holes in him. And I had never seen bullet holes in a human being and what they do. And I got home that night and I was a broken human being. I don't think I've ever reached that point of just trauma and pain and hurt and anger at my country, where we put our hands on our hearts and we all swear an oath. Imagine this, we swear an oath to liberty and justice for all. But how many of us have proven worthy of our ancestors who were willing to die for those ideals and principles, through whether it's people like Alice Paul protesting in front of the White House, being force-fed, going on hunger strikes, or whether it was great freedom riders, or all the people who lived those ideals better than I have. And that night, I just remember trying to scrub the boy's blood off of my hands and feeling such anger at the world and really ready to quit. Why was I even bothering, and surrendering to despair and cynicism? And the next morning I woke up, I came down early, walked through that lobby, and in the back of my mind, I realized that that's where Mrs. Jones's son had been murdered. And just as I walked out, and this is why I believe in the intelligence of the universe, is just as I walk out of that lobby, it's early in the morning, and the only other person in that courtyard was Miss Jones, and her back was to me. And I stopped in my tracks, and she must have heard me, my internal screams, as if I was under 100 feet of water drowning. And she turns around, and she did the only thing I needed in that moment, was she opens her arms, and I ran across that courtyard as a little boy, and she just held me, and I just broke down and started crying. And she just starts rubbing my back, and she says two words to me that became like a mantra to me when I would eventually 2 years later become elected mayor. And I would say them on my toughest days, when I felt that seduction to despair again. I use them in the Senate when I feel like I'm banging my wall against implacable walls of resistance. And they're two words that have nothing to do with religion, but have to do with everything of why we're here, and everything to do with about a spirit and that grit and grace I mentioned that you also evidenced earlier. And so as I'm crying, she's rubbing my back, and she says those two words, which are simply, stay faithful, stay faithful, stay faithful. And so I just want to thank you all. I know you have good days and bad. I know that sometimes, we all know that sometimes courage is defined not about the big speech, but just getting out of bed in the morning, and pressing forward, and putting on your clothes and getting outside and going on to another day of living, of trying, of working. And so I am sustained by your faith, because as we see a virus circling the globe, faith and love is the most viral force on the planet still. And I just want to thank you all for being faithful in your work and in your spirit, and you all give me strength and courage in my convictions. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for your time together. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Again, everyone, please stay healthy, stay well, remember to vote, and we'll see you all soon. Be well. Take care, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you
so much.
Have a great day.